Picture this. You're a Viking chieftain. You've spent your whole life killing people for land, killing people for gold, killing people because your dad killed people, and that's just the family business. You've raided 3 continents, you've got a longship full of stolen silver, and you genuinely believe the way you die is going to matter. Valhalla's waiting. The gods are watching. Surely a guy like you gets an ending worthy of a saga. Spoiler, most of you don't. Oh, hey there. I'm your host, Dead, mildly disrespectful, and back with a topic that's less about how the body fails and more about how history lies to you. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're going through the actual deaths of 9 of the most legendary Viking leaders in history, the guys the movies and shows are based on, and figuring out how many of them actually went out in a blaze of glory versus how many of them just got sick and died in a bed somewhere, which frankly is the ending nobody puts on a poster. Let's find out how the toughest guys in the 9th and 10th century actually met the end. Before we start, quick game. I'm going to say something about how Vikings died and you tell me true or false. Ready? Round 1. Most famous Viking warlords died gloriously in battle, sword in hand, screaming their way into the afterlife. True or false? False. Way false. A lot of these guys died of old age, illness, or, in one case, a saddle injury. Round 2. The stories we have about these deaths are all historically confirmed fact. True or false? False again. Most of this comes from sagas written 1 to 3 centuries after the fact by writers who really liked a good ending. Half of this is folklore wearing a historian's coat. Round 3. At least one Viking king got taken out by his own son. True or false? True. Betrayal doesn't care how many countries you've conquered. Okay, let's start at the top with the guy everybody thinks they know. Ragnar Lothbrok. Depending on which historian you ask, Ragnar was either a real chieftain, a mashup of several real chieftains, or basically fan fiction that got out of hand over a few centuries. What we do have agreement on is the ending. He raided Northumbria, it went badly, and King Aella had him thrown alive into a pit full of venomous snakes, cold stone room, nothing but writhing bodies and bad decisions. And according to the sagas, the guy laughed, cursed Aella on his way out, told him his sons were coming for revenge. Whether that's real or just really good propaganda for his kids, it became the single most retold death scene in Norse literature. Defiant to the last breath, allegedly. Then you've got Ivar the Boneless, a name that should come with a horror movie score attached. Nobody actually agrees on why he's called that. Maybe a bone condition, maybe insane flexibility, maybe just a nickname that stuck because it sounded terrifying. What isn't up for debate is that this man ran Dublin like a personal kingdom, feared by Norse and Irish alike. And after all that, after building a reputation that made grown warriors nervous, he died of a sudden illness around 873. No battlefield, no last stand, no saga writer even bothered to dress it up. The guy who made kings scream just quietly got sick and stopped existing. And somehow, that's worse than if he'd gone down fighting. Björn Ironside took a fleet through the Mediterranean, sacked what he thought was Rome, and it turned out to be a random Italian city called Luna. Imagine planning the greatest heist of your career and hitting the wrong building. After years of raiding Spain, North Africa, and Italy, after apparently ruling as King of Sweden, Bjorn died of old age. Not a betrayal, not an ambush, just old age, which for a professional pillager is basically a plot twist. Rollo of Normandy is where it gets interesting, because he actually won. He raided France so relentlessly that the French king just handed him land to make him stop, and that land became Normandy. But old habits die hard, and there are accounts of him sacrificing 100 Christian prisoners to the old gods right before his own death, which is a hell of a way to hedge your bets on the afterlife. He died around 928, old age again, a pagan raider who spent his final years as a Christian duke while apparently still keeping the receipts open with his old employer. Erik Bloodaxe earned that name honestly. He killed several of his own brothers to grab the Norwegian throne. That's not a metaphor, that's the actual resume. It didn't work long term. His surviving brother ran him out of the country, and Erik eventually ended up ruling York before dying in an ambush at the Battle of Stainmore in 954. Cut down in a narrow mountain pass through betrayal. The guy who murdered his way to power got taken out by someone else's treachery. There's a kind of poetry in that if you squint. Harald Bluetooth united Denmark, pushed into Norway, and got the country converted to Christianity, which he proudly carved onto a giant stone that's still standing today. Then his own son led a revolt against him. Harald got wounded in the fighting, fled the country, and died in exile in what's now Poland. Abandoned by the kingdom he built, replaced by his own kid. And yes, before you ask, the Bluetooth on your phone is named after this exact guy, which he would have found deeply confusing. Leif Erikson sailed to North America 500 years before Columbus got the credit, converted to Christianity, and then just disappears from the record. No dramatic ending, no battle, no illness even mentioned. Historians estimate he died around 1020, and that's basically it. The greatest explorer of the entire Viking Age just fades out of the story, which feels like a genuine crime against narrative structure. Olaf Haraldsson, better known as Saint Olaf, forced Christianity onto Norway through a mix of faith and violence that, depending who you ask, makes him either a saint or a war criminal. Chieftains eventually kicked him out. He came back to reclaim his throne and got killed at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, struck by a spear, a sword, and an axe at almost the exact same moment, which honestly sounds engineered for maximum symbolism. He was canonized a year later. A cathedral got built over his grave. Norway's patron saint was killed by other Norwegians, and somehow that made him more popular, not less. Then there's Canute the Great, who at his peak ruled England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden without losing a single major battle. Most people only know him from the myth where he commands the tide to stop, which everyone gets backwards. He wasn't proving he had power over the sea, he was proving to his flattering court that he didn't. He died of illness in 1035, somewhere around 37 to 40 years old, and his empire fell apart within years because his sons immediately turned on each other. The man who held 4 kingdoms in one hand left behind absolutely nothing that lasted more than a decade. And finally, Harald Hardrada, the guy historians point to as the actual end of the Viking Age. He'd fought across Russia, the Mediterranean, and North Africa before taking the Norwegian throne, and in 1066 he invaded England, won a battle at Fulford Gate, and then got blindsided 5 days later at Stamford Bridge by an English army that had force-marched the entire distance north. A lot of his men weren't even wearing armor. He took an arrow to the throat. His fleet had arrived with 300 ships. The survivors needed 24 to get home. That's not a defeat, that's an extinction event. So, what's the actual takeaway here? Out of 9 legendary Viking leaders, feared men, empire builders, guys whose names are basically synonymous with terror, only a handful actually died the way you'd expect. Most of them got taken out by illness, old age, betrayal from their own family, or in William the Conqueror's case, a saddle injury that turned into a slow, undignified death where his own attendants abandoned the body to go loot his stuff before he'd even been buried properly. Legend and reality rarely agree on how the story is supposed to end. The sword in hand, blaze of glory death is the exception, not the rule. And honestly, that's true for basically everyone in history, not just Vikings. So, there you have it. How every major Viking leader actually died. And spoiler, it's a lot less Valhalla and a lot more hospital bed than the movies want you to believe. Turns out, even the men who conquered continents couldn't out-negotiate biology. Hit subscribe if you want to keep exploring the worst, weirdest, and most anticlimactic ways history's toughest people met their end. I'll be here. I'm dead. I've got time.